realm. This greetings in the custom of Aotearoa, New Zealand and the Pacific is to acknowledge the spiritual realm of this land, and also greetings to the sky and the waters and the land, and particularly of Malaysia. Extend great appreciation to our hosts, particularly Professor Zoll, who has kind of carved out a really acknowledged the Pacific. Often our region is called the Asia Pacific, and it seems to often collapse the Pacific dimension of that. So thank you, and we bring greetings from the group of us who you met in Japan, Professor Zoll. And also greetings to the house where we're meeting, to the University of Nottingham in Malaysia, and also acknowledging University Sans Islam Malaysia, which hosted us yesterday and is obviously part of this. And greetings also to the indigenous people of Malaysia, the Orang Asli. And greetings to all of you. We say Inga Ho E Wha, which means greetings to people from the four winds, or from the four corners of the earth, which you've marvellously brought together. So I kept this slide up because it gives you a sense of the Pacific Islands. But I've really rethought my paper partly because of reading Gotham's paper a few days ago. And I'm thinking of the way in which in the Pacific we've needed to find a way to cross our worlds, or to live side by side more respectfully than obviously the colonial history that we have. And so I'm just going to give you a few slides of context. The Pacific, which we refer to as we come from the water continent. It's the only continent that stretches from pole to pole. And of course it's extremely important in terms of the ecology of the Earth's climate, in terms of the vast expanse of the ocean. And so this is a Pacific island. I'm from New Zealand, which is also a Pacific island, but because we're part of the OECD, we like to think that we're part of Europe somehow or other. So we have quite confused identities. Again, a Pacific image, this tūhau waka is often what I use as an image of where two peoples might learn to be alongside each other. The tūhau waka is for the long journey together across the Pacific Ocean. It's not for a short day fishing. And recently there's been a rebuilding of these traditional navigational vessels that are crossing the Pacific in order to recover the knowledge of navigation using only the stars and the winds and the tides. And this one, Noa Lofa, is from Samoa, but there's been wakas from Tahiti and Tonga and Fiji, I think. There's about 5 of them. So there's a lot of knowledge that's of the ocean environment in these. And I did go on this waka, actually. Again, a Pacific image, which I won't expand on now, but ocean governance now encompasses the exclusive economic zones. So you get these extremely small island countries that have enormous responsibilities for the ocean, and you see there all the white area is actually the area of territorial governance in the Pacific. So you see it's very much an ocean-oriented environment. And And to bring us to Aotearoa, it was a little bit hard to know what image to portray of this. And this is an image of the Waikato River. And our centre is in the Waikato region. It's, you see here a Māori saying, actually, the river of life, which each curve more beautiful than the last. You see also the grassland. There's not trees right down to the river, and that does denote this is a very intense agricultural area. And whereas that would have been covered in forest, it's all been cleared. We're now growing dairy, growing cows on that land, and in order to export milk to China. And there's huge issues of pollution of the waterways. New Zealand has an extremely good marketing strategy. We advertise ourselves as 100% pure, but in fact 70% of our waters are polluted, and that's largely because of the land use. But those are all stories for another day. So just to bring us down, here, this is an image of my Iranian, French and Māori grandchildren, and all of their little placentas are in New Zealand. So just acknowledging, Professor Lutu, your recognition of the importance of the placenta. And in Māori language, the name for placenta is the same as for the land. So I thank you from those of you from Iran who sent greetings to the grandson on the left whose birthday it was yesterday. So I'm going to just shift a little bit away. This slide is not quite relevant yet. Maybe I should leave the slide of the children up until it becomes relevant. And want to talk about decolonisation as quite multi-dimensional, obviously, for a person like me, because it's about undoing my understanding of my world, as well as about recognising the value and importance of Indigenous people in New Zealand who were colonised. And I've suddenly, since being in Malaysia, become rather reluctant to use the term Indigenous, because in a way it's a sort of monolithic word. And I was very kindly hosted here 2 or 3 days ago and was taken to an Orangasli community. And I realised that's a completely different situation from New Zealand Indigenous communities, where people don't live in the forests. Māori, a lot of Māori do live on ancestral land. They're also highly integrated into our cities and our universities. In fact, we have Māori universities. And in fact, it would be good next time we meet for Māori to come themselves. It just happened that I was coming through Singapore, so professors all diverted me. But then you could hear much more directly about what's going on in terms of decolonisation. But for a person like me, who was probably quite well educated, I knew nothing about Māori history in my education. And it wasn't until I was quite a young adult that I read the Treaty of Waitangi, which is the treaty that was negotiated by missionaries between the British Crown and Māori leaders in 1840. And it reads as if it's a treaty of peace. It was intentionally to prevent some of the worst abuses of colonisation that were being recognised by then as happening in other countries, for instance in Australia. And it also preserved, it set out the terms of governance which allowed for governance by the British, and it ensured that Māori governance would continue. And of course, the terms of the treaty were broken pretty much straight away, and it was supposed to safeguard land and language and the resource base that Māori have or had. But in fact, it was really a very short time before there was so much British settlement that the new settlers outnumbered the Māori people. And so there was that systematic imposition of colonisation, which most of you will be familiar with, and I don't really want to trace that all the way through. I thought one small anecdote of the kinds of things that I've been exposed to that kept me thinking differently. I was reflecting with some Pacific colleagues, this is a long time ago now, and we were looking at the creation story of Christianity. And we must have been reading the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, where Eve eats an apple. And my Pacific friend said, "Why would she eat an apple? I'm sure she would have eaten a banana." And that immediately made me see how differently Pacific people saw paradise. You know, for them it's in the Pacific. It's not somewhere that the Bible indicates. So my quest has been to question what is the violence in the culture that I come from. Where is the source of this? And also what sources are there within our culture that we could bring forward for more respectful relationships with Indigenous people, in our case with Māori and with Pacific people. So that embarked me on a big a course of, my PhD is in philosophy, as a way of following this quest to understand the systems of violence, you know, and how we've come to privilege rationality and the priority of the individual and private property and values, particularly the value of freedom, which in many ways undergirds the social contract of Western countries. And of course philosophy takes you into ontology and quite detailed work that we haven't got time to really explore in detail. But basically that Nietzschean or the Cartesian binary dualism is what I discovered in my studies, and that Nietzschean concept of the master-slave relationship is extremely explanatory of what you can see, not only abstractly, but in countries of colonisation. For instance, in New Zealand, it's extremely divided between poor communities, which are mostly Māori and Pacific communities, and wealthy white suburbs. So although we've never had legal apartheid, we've had a system that was very similar. And in fact, some of the governors of South Africa were also governors in New Zealand. So you could look at that history and find a lot of links. So I suppose the central aspect of ontology that is so salutary in this whole area is that assimilation really begins with that objectification of the other, that sovereign, the identity of the sovereign individual is achieved by suppressing the other, by minimizing the value of the other. And although, and this seemed to be very explanatory of what I could see all around me and the assumptions of superiority that go with Western knowledge. However, I think it is really important not to be too monolithic about the West. Clearly, it has achieved a prevalence and a dominance that we need to continue to alter. But for instance, decolonisation, because I've worked closely with Māori, I've heard many people say, we didn't just have the Western system imposed on us, we chose it. We wanted Christianity because it helped us to address some of the aspects of our traditional religion or our traditional forms of practices that we found difficult. And it's also commonly said that for us, the knowledge from Britain was empowering. Of course, they didn't expect that it would be taken over. They saw it as simply a new dimension that they could take, that would enhance their own knowledge systems. So I began to see that this discourse of decolonisation can be quite oppressive if it's interpreted to mean that one system was imposed on the other without resistance. So that's just a little more nuance in the decolonisation discourse that we need to be thinking of. Anyway, in terms of some of the thinking that I've come to is, particularly working with some postmodern philosophers, is to discover a critique of freedom, because freedom is perhaps the one thing that we assume is a freedom of constraint, and that allows the supremacy of the individual sort of acquiring whatever knowledge or possessions or so on. And I've been very interested in this saying, which is that responsibility grows in importance as the life of freedom discovers itself to be unjust. Perhaps a complex sentence, but it shows the idea that these highly valued premises of Western systems carry within them the seeds of destruction and injustice. And Levinas is regarded as a very eminent philosopher of relationality. And it's relationality that I was very interested to explore in terms of respectful relation. Like, how could we cohabit in a way that was respectful of difference rather than suppressing of it? And one way of thinking about this is to recognize that before we become individuals, before we become kind of rational subjects exercising autonomy and freedom, we are primarily relational. And this, again, Professor Lutu has eloquently exposed in speaking of our beginnings of life as an embryo in the placenta, and that feminine side which gives rise to all of life, and that all of life is primordially relational. And so how can we bring this relationality forward? How can we give it preeminence? And so one way of thinking about this is to turn from hostility, the hostility of imposing one system on another, and turn to an ethics of hospitality. And in giving privilege or priority to the other, we of course put in question the sovereign self, because we are no longer so preoccupied. We can't be preoccupied with our self-development because we're giving favour to the well-being of the other person. And so it's quite a deeply changing quality and value to offer hospitality. And of course, to give hospitality means to give water and food. And so we might take this motif of hospitality as a, if you like, a decolonising way of thinking. We can take it even further, because if we're offering water, we have to offer clean water, surely. So does that then take us to our stewardship of our waterways? You know, does it extend our sense of responsibility to the living world? If we're going to offer food, do we want to offer GM food? In New Zealand, we don't allow GM food at this point, but it takes us to our systems of agriculture, and are we offering nourishing food and sustaining the life of the other person? And it takes us to the systems of food production. You know, is it local food? Is it imported food? In New Zealand, we're a food-producing country, but we import 60% of our food. It seems unbelievable. So this idea of giving privilege to the other person opens up the idea that our relations are then governed by a teaching relation. We can't assume to know the other person on the basis of our own consciousness, but rather we are open to being taught about the life and the values of another person. It's a way of respecting our difference. And so rather than freedom and the supremacy of the individual, we could think about responsibility as a form of ethics, as a priority in our worldview that brings us alongside, well, for us in New Zealand, it brings us alongside Indigenous people in a way that's far more reflective of their worldview. And in Māori society, actually obligation is probably one of the most central ethics or values. And along with concepts of guardianship or stewardship and a holistic worldview, which is probably reasonably well known. Well, you may not know so much about Māori, but the ideas of kinship and intergenerational responsibility, and in Māori worldviews, all of life is interrelated, and there's a kinship between the living world and the, well, all worlds are living, but there's a kinship between all life forms that I think we in the West are seeking this new sense of our interdependence with all forms of life. I was, in my paper that I've written, I explore a little bit the idea, some of the ideas in quantum physics, where there's some thinking, which I won't dare even open up now, but there's that sense that all life grows out of an interactive process. In fact, there's some coinage of New English, because English isn't actually very adequate to the understandings of the worldviews that we're trying to achieve now. And the sense that while, for instance, in embryology, when a cell multiplies, when a cell divides, it also multiplies. So although it brings out discrete forms, it also is deeply interrelated. I've got this is holoblastic, that cleavage in embryology, which shows that although discrete forms arise, they are also interconnected. Anyway, it's not time to go into that now. But I thought just a story to, I was walking up a river near the Waikato with some Māori elders, and we were noticing that all the surrounding trees had been bulldozed down and the river was left completely exposed. There had been no recognition of the importance of shade for the health of the river, and it all became, the banks were falling in, and this is the elder who suddenly said, "Water has intelligence." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, see, it has consciousness. It's responding to the changes in the environment." And he was showing the the beginning of algal blooms, because the river was being overheated. And so that sense of the living world speaking and giving us information about what is happening was again a moment of understanding, you know, that the river is animate and conscious and responding actually with intelligence in the way that we expect of humans. So I just want to bring this to a close by saying also that the decolonising process, of course, is the history of colonisation and the imposition of Western forms of Western thought and systems is our maybe a primary focus, but it's actually got another level of importance, because it's this world which is largely a world which has separated nature from culture, which we've heard eloquently spoken about several times today. That is the world that is being destroyed, and we are destroying the fabric of life with our present systems, and we see it. You can see it in New Zealand, you saw it in those rivers. We can see it the way the hillsides are being bulldozed down and turned into roads and buildings. And so we're all now on a quest for a worldview of respect for the living world. And I think climate change is, I hope, it's compelling us to see that we have to change our systems of knowledge and to recognise that we can't just behave like rational people. We can't just use technology because we don't know the effects into the future. The Western knowledge doesn't have the capacity to safeguard the future. And we tend to think that we can captivate everything within knowledge and that we can acquire more and more knowledge. And so we do need a system that recognises that we are only a small part of the big living universe, and that we need to find the knowledge that will support our place in it. And so we might say that we're in a time when we're in an enormous transition from this geopolitical world that you can see on that slide up on the left, towards an ecological view of the world, where our knowledge has to develop and evolve very rapidly. And one of the things we must do is bring the knowledge of local people and indigenous communities to the tables of decision making, and not just see it as an exotic part on the side, but that this is the source of learning that we need to acknowledge. So thank you very much for the opportunity.